distinguished guests, colleagues, students, good evening. My name is Uta Peuger, and I'm the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities here at Northeastern. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you this evening to our Morton E. Ruderman Memorial Lecture. This evening's event is named after Morton E. Ruderman, who graduated from Northeastern with a degree in engineering in 1959, and who became a champion of Jewish studies with a big legacy here at the university. It's my special honor this evening to welcome members of Morton Ruderman's family, especially Morton's children, Sharon Shapiro, Todd Ruderman, and Jay Ruderman. And it's just wonderful to see some of your children and family members here with you tonight on this occasion where we celebrate the legacy of your father and grandfather. And I also really want to extend a very heartfelt thank you from all of us for the work that you are doing together with Northeastern. It really means a lot. Thank you. With the Morton Ruderman Memorial Lecture, the Ruderman Family Foundation and the Ruderman family have allowed the Northeastern Jewish Studies Program and also the Northeastern Humanities Center to provide Northeastern and Boston communities with truly unique experiences. The Ruderman Memorial Lecture gives us the opportunity to engage with prominent intellectuals, with scientists, artists, with writers, who teach us about Jewish history and culture, and who at the same time raise questions of universal significance. Questions, for example, about religious diversity, or questions about trauma and the past, or questions like the ones we will be tackling tonight on what Jewish traditions may teach us about important issues in ethics and the relationship between humans and technology, specifically biotechnology today. We are grateful to the Ruderman family and the Ruderman Family Foundation for making complex engagements with Jewish religion, culture, and history, including this evening's engagement with bioethics, possible for students and for a broader public here at Northeastern. Let me then turn the microphone over to my colleague, Lori Lefkowitz, who has multiple roles here at Northeastern. Lori, multiple roles grow from a core commitment that we have at the university to the interdisciplinary field of Jewish studies. Lori Lefkowitz is professor of English and also the Ruderman Professor of Jewish Studies, as well as director of our Jewish Studies program, and last but not least, the director of our Northeastern Humanities Center. That center, as well as Jewish Studies, are housed in the College of Social Sciences and Humanities. And Professor Lefkowitz will introduce this year's Ruderman lecturer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Peuger, and thank you to the College of Social Sciences and Humanities for enabling all of our programming. And I want to thank all of you for being here for this year's annual Ruderman Lecture in Jewish Studies. And of course, I too am especially delighted to recognize the presence this evening of Morton and Marcia Ruderman's children and other members of the Ruderman family. As you heard, Morton Ruderman, the late Morton Ruderman, graduated Northeastern with a degree in engineering. He was grateful to this university for the education that contributed to his success, and his decision to support Northeastern by developing the Jewish Studies program at his alma mater testifies also to his devotion to both Northeastern and the study of Judaism. It is fitting that the Ruderman Family Foundation has extended Morton Ruderman's legacy with a Northeastern University lectureship that showcases frontier work in Jewish studies. I did not know Morton Ruderman for very long before he died, but I remember him, and I remember his genuine warmth, his smile, his caring voice, and his evident love for and pride in his children and grandchildren, who are so clearly imbued with his values. The Ruderman Family Foundation's mission statement describes the Rudermans as a close-knit, hardworking, caring family, guided by Jewish values. The foundation builds bridges of understanding between Israeli and American Jewish communities, and it is an international leader in inclusion projects and advocacy for people with disabilities. As Northeastern University's Ruderman professor, I'm proud to be associated with a foundation that rests on the conviction that, and I'm quoting, inclusion and understanding of all people is essential to a fair and flourishing community, unquote. And this year, I also want to take the opportunity of having this audience to say that the study of Judaism has a lot to offer all of us. From the principle of welcoming the stranger, echoed at every Passover Seder, to the Jewish poet Emma Lazarus's words on the Statue of Liberty, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore." To the first Hebrew family, Abraham and Sarah, who are most honored for their value of hospitality, and the Midrash that imagines that their desert tent had 4 open tent flaps, one on each side, so that travelers could be welcomed from no matter what direction they came. The Jewish mystical tradition emphasizes the human power to repair the world by observing such commandments as the pursuit of fairness and justice. Jewish values emphasize what we call chesed, gracious generosity, caring for the poor and anyone who has been left behind. Judaism asks us to see divine glory in the faces of humanity in all of its diversity, emphasizing compassion so that when we are judged, we may have earned mercy for ourselves. So I'm very grateful for the support of the Jewish Studies program and for your presence here tonight. Paul Root Wolpe, tonight's speaker, is a renowned Jewish ethicist whose thoroughly interdisciplinary career perfectly exemplifies the value of translational research, which is what we care about so much at Northeastern University. Wolpe is the Asa Griggs Candler Professor of Bioethics, Raymond Schnazi Distinguished Research Professor of Jewish Bioethics, and Director of the Center for Ethics at Emory University. Dr. Wolpe served as the Senior Bioethicist at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, that is NASA, where he formulated policy on bioethical issues and safeguarding research subjects. He is the editor-in-chief of AJOB Neuroscience and sits on the editorial boards of over a dozen professional journals in medicine and ethics. Dr. Wolpe is a past president of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, president-elect of the Association of Bioethics Program Directors, a fellow of the Hastings Center, and a fellow of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, the country's oldest medical society. But he's trained as a social scientist, which is a rare background for an ethicist. His work focuses on the social, religious, ethical, and ideological impact of medicine and technology on the human condition. He's a founder of the field of neuroethics and speaks internationally in the field of Jewish bioethics. He is the bioethics advisor to JScreen, the program to promote preconception genetic carrier screening among Ashkenazi Jews in the United States. And he's co-authored the Guide to Jewish End-of-Life Issues, B'choref Hayamim, in the Winter of Life. This is the part I envy. Dr. Wolpe has been chosen by the website Faculty Row as a super professor and by the teaching company as a superstar teacher of America. His courses are distributed internationally on audio and videotape. He won the 2011 World Technology Network Award in Ethics, has recorded a fabulous TED Talk, was named a top thought leader in trustworthy business behavior, has been featured on 60 Minutes, and has a personal profile in the Science Times of the New York Times, and was profiled in 2011 Atlantic Magazine as a brave thinker. I can't resist adding that Paul Wolpe is also a longtime dear friend and I've been privileged to watch his fabulous musical daughters grow up, the older of whom is now a rabbinical student, following in the tradition of the rest of his family, which is, frankly, lousy with famous rabbis. He's not only accomplished and brilliant, but a funny, charming guy whose qualities of friendship exemplify that he lives by the ethics of which he speaks. I'm also a story freak. I love Shelley's Frankenstein. I love the Jewish mythology of the Golem, so I'm very excited for this talk.
Oh, thanks. Oh. I'm exhausted from that introduction. Can you hear me with the lapel mic? It's on. Can you hear me up there in the back? No, sort of. Let me just have this also. Better? Oh, yeah, I can hear the difference. I don't know. See if you can maybe turn the volume up on the lapel mic. So I'm really delighted to be here for many reasons. Both my parents were from the Boston area, so I had an opportunity to see relatives and friends, and it's been just a wonderful weekend visiting and being with people. So I want to thank Lori particularly for inviting me here. I want to thank the Ruderman family for funding this talk. And the reason I'm giving this particular talk is because 2018 is the 200th anniversary of the publication of Frankenstein. It was written in 1818, it was published in 1818 by a 19-year-old girl who wrote this at the behest of her lover when they had a contest to try to write a scary monster story, and only Mary Shelley's remains. We don't know what Byron wrote, but we know what Mary Shelley wrote. And I argue that, in fact, and some people dispute me on this, but I've yet to have anyone actually dispute me in a way that I think was, that I bought, that this is the single most influential book ever written by a woman in Western history. And if you think about it, it isn't just its impact on literature. We might think of some women who wrote books more impactful on literature. But the concept of Frankenstein, the image of Frankenstein, is known worldwide. Little kids in developing countries know who Frankenstein is. Every country that has a film industry has made a Frankenstein movie. So the impact of her idea of the modern Prometheus, as she called him, this idea of creating life, has resonated throughout the last 2 centuries in many, many different ways. And what I want to talk about today is how that story resonates today in contrast to another story, much older, perhaps less well known until recently, but equally profound, and that tries to explore that same liminal space between being human and not human that Frankenstein does. So, first thing I want to do is talk about these 2 examples that we're going to give and say a few things about them, and then move on to the comparison. So, the Golem. So this is a particular sculpture of the Golem by Ghiberti on his famous Gates of Paradise. They were named the Gates of Paradise by Michelangelo in the 15th century, and there is God creating Adam. So why do I say that this is a picture of the Golem? Because in Jewish thought, Adam was the first Golem. How is Adam a golem? Because a golem in Jewish thought was an unformed human being, not yet ensouled. And the story of the creation of Adam is God creating Adam out of dust and then breathing life into Adam. And in that period, between Adam's creation and Adam's ensoulment, Adam was a golem. Adam was a human being that was yet was not fully formed. And this idea of the golem resonates throughout history, and it's used in ways that people don't normally think of. It's not just the story of creating a human figure. A golem refers to many different unformed human beings. In Jewish thought, an embryo is a golem because God comes and ensouls the embryo at some point, and in that period before the embryo is ensouled, the embryo is a golem. And metaphorically speaking, we are all golems in the idea that we are still forming ourselves. But the earliest known written account of how to create a golem is in Sodeh Rizayah, or Rizayah Hamalach, the angel Rizayah. And this was there's a formula in this book on how to create a golem that was written in the 12th century. But the most famous example was in this book, Sefer Yetzirah. Nobody knows who wrote it. Part of it is credited all the way back to Solomon, the book of creation. And in it, it tells you how to create a golem. So why can't we all create a golem? Because a golem, it can only be created by those of great righteousness, as we'll see. That becomes a very important part of the story of the golem. The golem isn't created through a formula. The golem is created through deep piety, executing a formula with the strength of character and with the pious ability of the great rabbis. And in fact, it's almost a bellwether of how great a rabbi is, how close he can get to creating a human golem. The story is told in the Talmud of the most famous story of the golem before medieval times is the story of Rava and Rabbi Ze'ira. And it says in the Talmud, Rava created a man, a golem, and he sends it to Rabbi Ze'ira. And Rabbi Ze'ira sees this golem and says, you were created by the sages, by the magicians, some translate it, by the pietists, return to dust. And the question is, how did Ze'ira know that it was a golem? And the answer is because the golem couldn't speak. Because in Jewish thought, you have to be ensouled to speak. What's the difference between human beings and animals? It's that humans have language. And so human ensoulment must give us the gift of language. So one of the characteristics that differentiates the golem from the human being is their inability to speak. And the story of Ze'ira returning this golem to dust is the recognition by Ze'ira that Rava created this man that wasn't a normal human being because of its lack of ability to speak. The stories of the golem early on were not stories of the golem causing destruction. They were stories of creating animals. There are many golem animals created by the great rabbis or human beings. And it is a kind of theoretical question that the Talmud asks. You know, there's the old question in Christian theology, how many angels fit on the head of a pin, which has nothing to do with angels and pins, but has to do with how do we conceptualize infinity. If angels have no corporeal existence, then an infinite number of them can fit on the head of a pin. How could we conceptualize that? And many of the questions that were asked in our religious literature throughout history are not about what they seem to be about. They're about deep questions of the nature of life. And the golem questions are often about what makes something alive, when you talk about animals, for example, or when you begin to talk about human golems, where is that space between being human and not being human? A golem looks like a human being, talks, acts, can't speak. So where is that line and how do you differentiate it? So the rabbis will ask questions like, do you have to circumcise a golem? And it's not about golems and circumcision. It's about, is a golem sufficiently human to require circumcision? Or, as many of you know, you need 10 people to have a prayer quorum in order to do certain prayers. What if you have 9 people in a golem? Can the golem count as the 10th in your minion? And of course, that's not a question about golems and minions. It's a question about how do you decide if something is human enough to begin to get the rights of being human? And as we all know, that's a question that in many ways we have to explore today. The first, of course, the story of the golem that we all know, those of you who know the story, is a story of the golem running amok. That is, the golem is created and it turns on its creator. And the first story like that was Elijah of Helm was the first one to make a golem for a functional reason rather than a theoretical one. He made a golem to be a servant, and soon his golem turned on him. He had used a parchment that he put in the golem's mouth, and when the golem turned on him, he removed the parchment, and the golem collapsed into a heap of mud. However, by far the most famous story of the golem is the story of Rabbi Lowe of Prague, the Maharal. If you go to Prague, you will see this statue, which is the statue of the golem. And one thing that struck me is when I first saw this statue was how much it looks like Darth Vader. It's got the helmet, it's got the cape, it's got everything, but notice it has no face because we don't know what a golem really looked like, and there are lots of artistic, I'll show you in a minute, of interpretations of the golem. But this is the statue, and by the way, in Prague you'll also see statues of Rabbi Lowe. Rabbi Lowe was probably the greatest rabbi of his day and had a great impact not only on the Jewish community but on the secular community of Prague, so there is a statue to him. This is an artist's conception of Lowe creating the golem. So the story of Rabbi Lowe, the Maharal, creating a golem is this. The Jews were besieged at the time, and they were being oppressed by their Christian neighbors, and they needed a protector. So Rabbi Lowe, who, by the way, was not only a protector of the Jews, but was a consultant to the Emperor Rudolph II of Habsburg, who was the emperor of that area, who was very into the occult and very into alchemy and mysticism and studied Kabbalah. We know certainly of one meeting that Lowe had with the emperor, and he probably had many more, and the emperor would consult him on questions of Jewish mysticism. So in the 16th century, there was persecution at the hands of a bishop named Thaddeus, who had been Jewish, converted to Catholicism, and then became one of the real oppressors of the Jewish community, a story, unfortunately, that happens over and over again. And Rabbi Lowe decided that they needed a protector, so he went down to the Vltava River with some of his disciples, and they dug the shape of a human body out of the mud of the river, by the riverside. He engaged in a number of incantations and secret Jewish rituals in order to animate the creature, and the creature became a protector of the people. Soon after a while, the creature more and more began to act out and finally turned and began to wreak havoc, at which time Rabbi Lowe decommissioned his creature. And how do you decommission a golem? Well, in the case of Elijah of Helm, they talk about putting a parchment in the golem's mouth to animate him and removing the parchment to deanimate him. In the case of Rabbi Lowe, they usually talk about putting the word emet, which means truth, on the forehead. That is, by carving the word emet into the forehead of the golem. That was the final act that animated him. And then if you remove that first letter, aleph, you end up with the word met, which means death in Hebrew. And so the way he just went up to his golem and went like that, and the golem collapsed into a heap of mud. This is the Alt Nushul in Prague, the old Nushul, and this is where Lowe decommissioned his golem, according to the story. If you see that, if you see this place, this is the door. That's the door to the attic. There's a ladder from here that goes up, and the story is that Lowe brought the golem up into the attic, just decommissioned it. It collapsed into a pile of mud, which stayed up in the attic ever since, and there's supposedly prayer shawls over it. Nice story. Unfortunately, people have gone up there, and there are no piles of dirt or prayer shawls. Doesn't mean that there weren't once, but there aren't now. But you can go visit the Alt Shul. My wife and I did last summer, and you can see the door, and you can see the ladder, and you can see the statues of the golem and things like that. The idea of the golem was a very obscure idea for many, many, many years. Recently, though, the golem is really hot, and you can find golems everywhere. These are just a few, the Isaac Shevis-Basinger's story of the Golem, Elie Wiesel's story of the Golem. You Google, you just Golem books and you'll find thousands of them. But not just books. This is what you get if you put the Golem in, and you get all of these. This is the very famous, I have this little statue in my office. That's a famous drawing of it. These are all, that says Emmet on the stomach, rather. There it is on the head. These are all pictures of the Golem. We'll return to this guy in a few minutes. But if you just put Golem and not the Golem, you get things that look like this, because golems have become a very popular character in video games. And there are all kinds of golems in video games, and they're formed in all different kinds of ways. But in every case, they are kind of almost human animated creatures. You can even find a wonderful episode of The Simpsons where a golem comes into town and they actually recreate almost the whole story of Rabbi Lowe. There's a wonderful X-Files episode where they have to go and find a golem that has also been causing problems in town. And here was a wonderful advertisement in Craigslist, looking for rabbi versed in dark Talmudic arts to create golem. Wanted. One rabbi versed in the dark Talmudic arts to create one golem for a household of 3. Golem will perform rudimentary household chores such as dishes and sweeping, basic math tutoring for our daughter in 3rd grade, and basic household security. Golem must be obedient and fairly unobtrusive on our everyday lives. We will supply all materials needed, clay, twigs, calfskin, parchment, etc. Needed to create the golem. All you need to do is use your magical ancient rabbinic skills to animate said golem. Please know, we are looking for a rabbi to create a golem, an anthropomorphic being created from inanimate matter from Jewish folklore, not Golem, a former hobbit turned into a monster and looking for precious. This is important. We have no interest in living with Golem. We want a golem. Please respond, serious inquiry only. That's someone with a real sense of humor. But, of course, one of the reasons why you see this interest in the golem reestablished is because the question of the golem that the rabbis asked is a question we are asking today in many, many different ways. We're asking it through the question of animal rights. How human does a great ape need to be before we want to cede it some of the rights of human beings, right? Because before, the idea was always that there was this enormous gap between even the greatest apes, even the bonobos and the chimpanzees and human beings. And now as we begin to try to define what that gap is and what makes that gap meaningful, it's become more and more difficult. And we have, there are laws that have been passed that have stopped research on the great apes. And the question is, how far do we go? And that is a question about the golem in a different guise. It is about what distinguishes us as human beings and what makes the differentiation meaningful between us and other creatures. And we're asking that same question not only about apes, but about robots. And there are many examples of that in fiction. There's examples of that on television. Westworld, for those of you who've watched Westworld, was an entire series dedicated to the question of these humanoid androids and whether they have rights or not, and how we treat them, and whether treating them in bad ways matters since they're not fully human. They noticed that if animals have rights, should robots, and part of the story is about Harambe, the ape that was killed when the boy fell into the ape pit a while ago. So, to really deeply understand the idea of the golem, we have to think deeply about the idea of being unfinished, unformed. The reason that there's an old Yiddish saying, Der Olam is a golem, the whole world is a golem, is the literal translation, is that we're all involved in the process of finishing. The idea of tikkun olam that we'll talk about in a minute in Judaism, of our job, part of our job is finishing the world, suggests that the world is unfinished. I have been staying this weekend with my friends Lori Lefkowitz and Lenny Gordon, and yesterday morning when I got up, I went down to their kitchen, neither of them know this, and on the counter was a mug that said Yiddish proverbs. This talk was already written. This slide was already here. There's the mug. Der Oilem is a Golem, the masses are asses. Now that's an interesting translation of Der Oilem is a Golem, but it actually, this is your mug, Lori, but it actually captures something interesting, which is another use of the word golem or goylem in Yiddish, because if you call someone that, you are calling them an ignoramus. You're calling them an unformed person, right? So it means someone who isn't unsophisticated or perhaps even in some ways malevolent. So the masses are asses is one way, though the literal translation is much more profound. The world is a golem, not any particular individual and not masses, but all of us are in some ways unformed and need a certain amount of finishing. And I will leave the golem with this, and I'm not necessarily making any political statement. This was in the foreword in November. I just report. I didn't write this. I'm just reporting it. And I will let you look up what this is, but notice that the writer is from the Jewish Museum in Berlin, where they know a thing or two about golems. And I'm not going to talk about what the article is about. You can look that up yourself. But the point is that this idea of the golem has application across many, many different kinds of platforms and ways of thinking about the world. So that's the story of the golem in a nutshell. Now let's move to the other star of our show, Frankenstein. As I said, Frankenstein was written 200 years ago next year, and it was part of a contest that Byron and Mary Shelley and and one of their friends had to write a monster story. And if you haven't read Frankenstein in a long time, or maybe never read it, I strongly, strongly recommend that you go and read it again. I guarantee you it is not about what you think it's about. It's not about creating monsters. In the book, the actual creation of Frankenstein is one paragraph. It's a story about something else. It's a story about a man who gets it who discovers a technical ability and sees in that technical ability the possibility of becoming godlike. And then he creates this creature, and he muses on how these creatures he's going to create are going to be stronger and healthier. He's going to remove illness from the world, and they will worship him. So it comes out of a hubris, it comes out of a desire for greatness, and then he creates the creature, this modern Prometheus that he wants to create. And the moment that the book turns, and the sort of energizing climactic change in the book, is Frankenstein abandons his creature. He abandons the monster he created. And the question is, why did Frankenstein abandon the creature? He did it. He accomplished what he wanted to accomplish. He animated dead flesh. He created a creature that was bigger, 8 feet tall, stronger, faster, everything he had wanted. So let's read why it was that Frankenstein abandoned his creature. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe? Or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful, great God. His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but those luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun-white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. The different accidents of life are not so changeable as the feelings of human nature. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this, I had deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. He abandoned the creature because the creature was ugly. He had wanted to create the modern Prometheus. He had wanted to create a kind of Aryan ideal, a tall, handsome, strong, specimen of humanity. And what he created instead was ugly and watery and dun-colored, and he ran. And so the common picture of Frankenstein that we all see is not what Shelley had in mind. much closer is De Niro's portrait of the monster. Because, I mean, this in its own way is kind of handsome. You know, a little bit odd, but this is more of what the Frankenstein and Shelley's conception was. It was a creature so horrid as it ended as to drive him away. When Dolly the sheep was cloned, there was a great conversation, kind of hyperventilation around the world about human beings for the first time creating life in a certain way. And Leon Kass, who was the head of President Bush's Bioethics Commission at the time, wrote this article in the New Republic about cloned human beings. They are human, they cannot be replicated, the moral repugnance of cloning. And we're not going to talk about that so much. What we're going to talk instead is how people, when they are trying to talk about the ethical nature of biotechnology, especially new emergent biotechnologies, draw on Frankenstein over and over again. The picture that illustrated this article inside was this one, which you saw in my opening slide. Frankenstein with a set of deranged-looking dolly heads, sheep heads on his chest, as the illustration of what it means to go too far, to meddle in those things human beings shouldn't be meddling in. And it is not just an illustration. Franken has become a prefix. We talk about Franken cells and Franken foods and Franken genes and Franken fish and Franken rice. When we create things that we think encapsulate this idea of human beings messing with technology, we use Franken from Shelley as a sign, symbol of that concern. This was in USA Today last May. This was in just last week, Frankenfood or Farm Fresh. We all get what that means. That's how powerful this idea is in the popular imagination. Now, before I go and explore the intersection of those two ideas, I just want to say a couple of words about biotechnology. We are creating new forms of life. This is the AA salmon, which is a salmon that was created. This is a regular salmon. This is the AA salmon, the Aqua Advantage salmon, which is genetically modified or genetically engineered salmon made from a Chinook salmon and the genes of something called an eel pout, which is another kind of eel-like fish. When they put that gene into the salmon, those two genes into the salmon grows almost twice as fast as a regular salmon with the same or even a lesser amount of food, and it grows to another third the size. So the idea was you get more salmon, more bang for the buck, and they tried for 10 years, or almost 10 years, to get this salmon approved, and in December of 2015, the AA salmon was approved by the FDA for human consumption. You still can't buy it yet in your supermarkets, but there's nothing stopping them now from selling it there. We're turning animal bodies into pharmaceutical manufacturing plants. This is a goat whose milk expresses antithrombin, a drug that can be extracted from the goat. The goat is genetically modified so that the molecule you want for antithrombin is expressed in its milk. And we've already begun this process, also a process, by the way, that's been approved by the FDA, and it probably won't be too long that we'll have flocks of animals, herds of animals, who are living pharmaceutical manufacturing plants. We have created animals by genetically engineering their embryos with green fluorescent protein that glow in the dark. These are monkeys. We have rabbits, dogs, pigs, cats. When they are embryos, we genetically engineer green fluorescent protein into the early embryos, and now every cell in their body expresses green fluorescent protein. This is the famous mice created by Charles Vacanti of the University of Massachusetts. What he did was he took a mouse that was genetically engineered so that its skin was less reactive to human skin. He took a polymer scaffolding of a human ear, put it under the skin grew over and created an ear, and the idea is that you could extract the ear from the back of the mouse. You don't even have to sacrifice the animal, and if you lost an ear in a fire, or if you boxed Mike Tyson and he bit it off, you could actually take a mold of the existing ear, flip it, and create an ear that you could then xenotransplant onto a human being. It's never been done. It's never been transplanted, just a proof of concept. And then just a few weeks ago, this is a chimeric pig. A chimera is an animal with DNA cells of two different, usually unrelated species or unrelated people. This pig has human cells, human heart cells growing inside. The idea would be someday pigs are the animals whose physiology are the closest to ours, whose hearts are the closest to our shape of hearts. And the idea would be that someday we could have a flock of pigs, a gaggle of pigs. I'm a city boy, I don't know what a lot of pigs are. A bunch of pigs whose hearts were made of human heart cells. And if someone needed a transplant, you'd pick the pig that was the most histocompatible, that's genetically the most compatible with the human. You'd slaughter the pig, you'd take the heart, and you could transplant it, and we wouldn't need human transplants nearly as much anymore. The point of all this is to say that the power that we have today to genetically manipulate the plasms of human life is so far beyond what it was just a short time ago that the questions of how we negotiate that space have become really quite trenchant. So it's not that surprising that stories like Frankenstein and the Golem become part of the ways we discuss things. So this was the first cloned animals of all their kinds. That's Dolly, the first cloned sheep, as we were just discussing, now happily stuffed in a museum in Edinburgh. You can go see her. That's Ralph the rat, which was the first cloned rat. Cece the cat, for cloned cat. For those of you who know my age, you also know what CC stands for, carbon copy. I ask my students, what else does CC stand for? And one or two of them will raise their hand and go, carbon copy, because they heard it from their parents. And I say, so what's a carbon copy? They don't have any idea. Never got their hands black with that carbon. It's a shame they've never had the experience. This is Prometheus, the first cloned horse, a Haflinger horse cloned in Italy, which was a great sort of golden ring of cloning, because a lot of horses that win races are geldings, right? They've had their sexual equipment removed, and so they become champion horses, but they can't be put out to stud. But if you can clone the gelding and have a fertile clone, you can put the clone out to stud and not have to, and so you get the advantage of having both the champion horse and the clone. This is a very famous dog, that's Snuppy. Snuppy stands for Seoul National University Puppy. It was cloned by Dr. Huang, very famous guy, and the reason that he became famous was not for cloning a dog, which was one of the most difficult animals to clone, and he could have been famous for the rest of his life and celebrated for cloning the dog, but then he went on to claim that he had cloned human embryos, which turned out to be a complete lie. He lost everything. He was condemned by his government and brought a lot of people down with him, but that's Snuppy. These were the first cloned calves. These are the first cloned pigs, and that is Noah. Noah is a cloned guar. A guar is an endangered East Asian ungulate, East Asian cattle. There aren't that many of them left, so they took a somatic cell, a body cell out of a guar, and they gestated it in the uterus of a cow, and they created Noah. Noah didn't live very long, but it was supposed to be proof of the idea that we can save endangered animals by using cloning technology. There's just one problem. For those of you who sort of have basic biology training, you will know that in our cells we have two kinds of DNA. We have DNA in the nucleus, which is the DNA we all talk about and think about, but we also have these little organelles they're called in our cells called mitochondria. They have their own DNA. And you get your mitochondria from your mother, and you get your mitochondria only through the ovum of your mother. And this guar, they took a somatic cell, took the nucleus out, and put it in a cow ovum. So even though Noah looks like a guar and walks like a guar and talks like a guar, or whatever else guars do, He actually is a guar whose entire body has cow mitochondria, not guar mitochondria. Now, we might think that's okay, though there are separate diseases that those two species get from their mitochondria. But it once again raises the question, is that a guar? Is it a hybrid? Is it close enough to a guar for us to call it a guar, or is it something else altogether? The point is the question of the golem and the question of Frankenstein raise their head over and over again as we think about modern biotechnology. George Church, one of the greatest scientists in the United States, the head of the, one of the great synthetic biology experts here at Harvard, announced, the Harvard team was led by George Church, that within the next 2 years they think they're going to be able to clone a mammoth. There again, it's going to be gestated in an elephant. It's going to have mixed DNA of elephants and mammoths, and so will it really be a mammoth? Or is it enough that it'll look like a mammoth? And is this something we should be doing? And before you say no, I have a serious question to ask you. If you found out that they successfully cloned a mammoth, and it was in a zoo here in Boston, tell me you would not go and see it, right? So it's one thing to condemn it, it's another thing to, and this was just last week. Not that long ago, a guy named Craig Venter, one of the greatest scientists who really completed the Genome Project, created the first artificial organism and its consequences. He took a bacterium, he took a DNA synthesizer, which is a machine that can create the DNA double helix. He used the DNA synthesizer to create the entire genome of a bacterium, a different one than the host bacterium. He took that genome, put it in the nucleus of bacterium type A, and when that bacterium split, it split into a different bacteria. And he called it the first time of humans creating life. It's not the first time humans, it's not creating an artificial organism, it's an artificial genome, but he had to use the existing structure of an existing cell, which reminds me of a great joke. A scientist turns to God and said, I'm as great as you are now. I too can create a human being from dust. And God says, okay, meet me out in the field and we'll have a create-off and we'll see who really is great. So the scientist walks out in the field, God's in the field, and God says, okay, you go first. And the scientist reaches down to get the dust and God goes, no, find your own dust. So Craig Venter created this artificial form of life, that's Craig. And the question becomes, I'm always asked this, how far do we go in creating these artificial forms of life? Well, we went far enough to give Craig Venter the highest civilian honor we give people in this country. But I want you to notice something else. Notice the picture that the economists used to discuss Craig Venter's achievement, right? They used the picture of the single most recognizable religious image that we have in the Western world. Not symbol like the cross, but image is the Sistine Chapel. And if you begin to look for it, you will see it everywhere. Whenever they discuss biotechnology, whether it's Time or Newsweek or Forbes, whether it's the scientific literature, whether it's Nature or Science, even Free Inquiry, which is the secular humanist anti-religion magazine, when it talked about cloning, used this image of the Sistine Chapel of human beings created by God, turned around in one way or another. And it tells us something. It tells us of the deep theological underpinnings of these questions. So, everybody thought Frankenstein's laboratory would look like this, but in fact, it looks like this. This is a DNA synthesizer. There's the ACGT bottles, and this machine creates artificial genomes. So, what might we learn from these two stories, and how might we think together about what Frankenstein and the Golem have to say to us today? I want to just do a nod to Byron Sherwin, who died last year, a wonderful Jewish studies professor who wrote this book, Golems Among Us, How a Jewish Legend Can Help Us Navigate the Biotech Century. A really wonderful book where he tells a lot of the stories of the golem. And if you're more interested in the kinds of things I'm saying, I recommend this book to you, and I've drawn some of this from that book. I also want to tell you about this movie, the 1950 movie Der Golem, directed by Paul Wegner. That's him. He also plays the golem. And the reason this is important is because I'm going to compare these two by using Boris Karloff's Frankenstein and Wegner's Golem as our symbols. So what is the difference between these two legends? What do they teach us differently? The creation of human life is improper, says Shelley. Dr. Frankenstein transgressed. Christianity and European history condemns him. The story of Frankenstein is a story of a transcending a limit that human beings shouldn't transcend. Not so of the golem. The Talmud accepts the creation of life by human beings. Rava, who creates that golem that he sends to Rabbi Zira that I told you about, he's not condemned for having created the golem. There's a cryptic story in the Babylonian Talmud that states, I'm reading now, on the eve of every Shabbat, on the eve of every Sabbath, Yehuda HaNassi's disciples, Yehuda HaNassi was one of the greatest rabbis in history. He created the Mishnah, which all of Judaism is based on. His disciples, Rab Chanina and Rab Hoshaya, who devoted themselves especially to the mystical arts, used to create a delicious calf by means of the Sefer Yetzirah, the book I told you about that tells you how to make a golem, and ate it every Sabbath. So these are some of the great rabbis in the Talmudic lore. They're not condemned for having created artificial calves to eat. Of course, it's a really interesting question. If you keep kosher and you create an artificial calf, do you have to slaughter it according to the laws of shechita, according to the laws of kashrut? Right? Because it is not born of an animal. Is it really a calf? Just another question that we ask to try to understand this differentiation. And by the way, completely irrelevant digression. You know where else this question was asked really interestingly? So Jews can't eat, for example, cheeseburgers because it's a mixture of milk and meat. But what if you were on the Starship Enterprise and the replicator could make a cheeseburger? No animal was killed. No milk was involved. It replicates molecularly the structure of a cheeseburger. Could you eat it? You see, these are the important questions that religion has to offer us. Next. The creature, and remember, please, this is not Frankenstein. This is the creature. Frankenstein created the creature, but nowhere in Shelley does Shelley name this Frankenstein. That happened in the movies. And the movies are almost never about what the book is about with Frankenstein. So this is the creature. The creature is different than human beings solely in his appearance and physiology. In fact, Shelley doesn't really ask the question in a deep way, what is the difference between being almost human and human? The assumption in Shelley is, well, the monster may not be fully human, maybe another kind of species as Frankenstein wanted it to be, but it clearly deserves all the rights of human beings. That's the whole point of the book. Not true with the golem. The golem is different than human beings. The golem has no soul. And so the real question of the golem is, what are the implications of having no soul? In fact, if we want to really create modern metaphors, the metaphor of Frankenstein is more the metaphor of the immigrant, right? The other, the human being who's different, and do we accept them in their difference? While the metaphor of the golem is the metaphor of biotechnology. How do we negotiate this barrier between the human and the not human, the species and the not species, the mammoth and the elephant, the guar and the cow? The creature is unnatural, a freak. Frankenstein abandons him because of his horror at the creature's non-naturalness. Doesn't look like a human being. Golems are extension of the natural, part of the co-creation with God. part of tikkun olam, this idea in Judaism that every human being is responsible to try to finish God's work, to co-create with God, to finish the unfinished work of the world. And the golem is just another example of that. The creature is made biologically, right? Frankenstein goes out and gets parts, and he puts the parts together, and then he figures out how to animate the parts. But the golem is made genetically. The golem is made through 3 letters that animate the golem through text. And that idea of text, as I'll show you in a minute, is a very important piece of the way in which the golem is conceptualized. Let me just get that up here. Yeah. So, Golmi ro'u einecha v'al sifrecha kulam yikatevu. Thine eyes did see my unformed substance, meaning God's eyes. Golmi, golem, that's where the word comes from, that which is unformed. But then the rest of that sentence was, and in your book it was all written. So right there we have in Psalms, this is from Psalms, right there in Psalms we have this juxtaposition of the idea of the golem and text. And there is some attempts by some people metaphorically to talk about the idea that the way you create the golem is through text, first of all through the invocation of the sacred name of God, and then through the inscribing of text on the golem. And the sacred name of God is 4 letters, and the chemical makeup of DNA is 4 letters, and what you inscribe on his head is 3 letters, and every 3 base pairs in DNA make a protein. So people have stretched this metaphor probably to the breaking point, but even if you don't buy any of that, there clearly is a difference between biologically putting together a creature from parts and animating it, and taking clay and using text to not just animate it, but to completely turn it into a living creature of flesh and blood. The creature in Frankenstein is anonymous, usually just called the monster or the creature in Shelley, though we call it Frankenstein because of the movies. But in the book, the creature never has an identity. In Rosenberg's book, Niflaot Maharal, The Miracles of the Maharal, The Miracles of Rabbi Lowe, the creature's named Joseph, or as the town so call him, Yossele. It's nice that they have such a lovely, intimate name for their golem. But of course, that's important because it's a different relationship that you have. And here I want to digress for 1 second and talk about how you make a golem very quickly. And I talked already about this idea of being co-creators, and that's why making a golem is perfectly okay. It's part of that co-creation. But the reason rabbis can make a golem, and this is very important for the next point I want to make, is this. So this is a verse from the Bible. Your iniquities have separated you and your God, and your sins have hid God's face from you so that God will not hear. So this is used as a proof text of the idea that the thing that separates us from God, that makes us less than God, are our iniquities. And we all have them. And so we can never really achieve the ultimate of being human because our iniquities take away that divine power from us that's inherent in each of us. Therefore, the fewer iniquities you have, the closer to God's power you can get. And that's why Rabbi Lowe can create a golem. And that's why there's a hierarchy of the types of golems rabbis can create. The lesser pious rabbis might be able to create a golem animal. But the greatest rabbis of all, the Ravas and the Lows, can create a human being because they have fewer iniquities and therefore are closer to God. But no matter how great you are, you still have iniquities, so you can never take that final step and create an ensouled being. But if you really have the fewest iniquities of all, you're less separated from God, and so you can create a golem, and that's why they can do it. How do you create Frankenstein? Doesn't matter how good you are, bad you are as a person. Doesn't matter how pious you are. We all remember that classic, wonderful movie that taught us everything we need to know about this creature called Young Frankenstein. right? Remember Young Frankenstein? Gene Wilder finally gets to his grandfather's castle. They find his secret laboratory. Gene Wilder breaks into the laboratory, and there's his father's laboratory with all the ancient mechanisms, and there's a table. And on the table is his grandfather's diary that tells you how to make Frankenstein. Does anybody remember what the title of that book was? How I Did It. That's all you need to know. That's all you need to know. If you have the formula, if you know how Victor Frankenstein did it, you can do it too. Don't have to be pious. You don't have to be low in iniquities. You just need the formula. And that is a fundamental difference between Frankenstein and the Golem. Anyone with the right technical knowledge can manipulate life and create the monster. But only the most righteous can create a Golem. And your degree of success is correlated with your degree of righteousness. This is not a trivial point. When you poll the American people about what scares them the most about biotechnology, it's not biotechnology. It is scientists. People are scared that scientists don't have a moral compass. Now, it's not true. I know lots of scientists. They talk about moral issues quite a bit. They have conferences on it. But that's the fear, that the creators of modern technology will create Frankenstein, not the Golem. That they will just use the formula to create whatever kind of creatures they want, and they won't think this through with a degree of piety, humility, and righteousness. Frankenstein is motivated by glory and hubris. No one can conceive the variety of feelings which bore me onwards like a hurricane in the first enthusiasm of success. Life and death appeared to me ideal bounds which I should first break through and pour a torrent of light into our dark world. A new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. I'm going to create these creatures so that they will be grateful to me, will worship me, will bless me as their creator. But the creator of the Golem does it in the service of the protection of the people, does it with humility, and understands that he's got a great power at his disposal and that it requires a certain amount of responsibility. Frankenstein abandons his namesake because of his horrid appearance, and the monster takes revenge, and then there's the rest of it's a chase scene. As by the way, why does Frankenstein abandon his monster? His monster kills members of his families and everything. Finally, they have a coming of terms. And what is the final break of Frankenstein and the monster? The monster comes and says to Frankenstein, okay, I was really angry at you for abandoning me, but I'll forgive it all if you do me one thing. Make me a mate. So create a female monster, and we'll call it even. Frankenstein creates the female monster, takes one look at it and says, how can I do this? They're bigger than us, stronger than us, faster than us. Seems pretty smart too. If they mate, they will create a new species that will wipe out human beings. So he kills the female creature that he made and decides that he has to kill his other monster too, and that's when he goes off to try to kill Frankenstein, try to kill the monster. But the creators of the Golem take full responsibility for its creation, its actions, its ultimate termination. They know that if they created it, they have to do something about it. And what that ends up meaning is that once Frankenstein was created, you couldn't uncreate him, and once the monster was created. And Frankenstein had no way to stop his monster, so he gets a gun, and he goes to the Arctic, where the monster has fled to, and he chases the monster into the deep Arctic, where Captain Walton, who actually writes the book, Frankenstein is a narrative within a narrative within a narrative, and it starts with letters of Walton, the sea captain, to his sisters. They see this body on the ice, practically dead. That's Frankenstein. They bring him in, and he tells them the story. He has chased this creature all the way up into the Arctic, and he ends up dying, Frankenstein does, and his creature flees deep into the Arctic and stays alive. While with the case of the Golem, as we know, is always under control of its creator. The rabbi can easily and immediately turn the Golem back into clay. And then, finally, the story of Frankenstein is about responsibility. It's about aesthetics, too, but it's about the responsibility, humility, it's about hypocrisy, and it's about the goals and limits of science, and it's about what it means to be human and how we think about that. While the message of many Golem tales, the later Golem tales, is about piety, service, but also about what it means to be human. There's a reason why these tales have lasted so long, why they've passed the test of time. They're deeply and subtly layered tales, and they ask profound questions that I think are very important for us to ask today as our biotechnology is taking us into a new period where the questions of barriers and the questions of how we differentiate things that we used to take for granted as being different before are really part of the challenges of the modern biotechnological ethic. And I think both of these tales deserve a moment's pause and a thought as we ask ourselves those questions. Next year is the 200th anniversary of the publication of this remarkable book. I strongly recommend that all of you go out and as a celebration of the achievement of this 19-year-old girl, you read this extraordinary book and maybe get Byron Sherwin's book too, and let's all ask those questions together. Thanks for your attention.
So Professor Wolpe will field questions. I want to ask you how you think about some of the ethical dilemmas like the treatment of animals and the borderline between the animal and the human. Is there another mic around?
So if you're asking the question about the borderline, there are two kinds of answers to that. One kind of answer is we created those borders, nature didn't. Right? Taxonomy is our creation. The idea that there are separate types of animals and that there's some strict line between them is us as human beings imposing our sense of order on the world, and nature doesn't work that way. Nature isn't as neat as our need to create categories makes it. So on the one hand, crossing those barriers, and nature crosses those barriers all the time. We have Neanderthal DNA, we have viral DNA, we are made up of many creatures. So there's nothing sacrosanct about species limits. The issue isn't so much crossing the barrier. The issue is crossing the barrier thoughtlessly and crossing the barrier without deep conversation about its implications. We're actually really bad at predicting downstream consequences of things we do. That's why we have alien species everywhere. That's why we have climate change. We do things for short-term gains that long-term end up being really destructive. We are entering an area, we have a new technology called CRISPR that makes it extraordinarily easy to genetically engineer organisms, relatively speaking. And pretty soon, I say that today, in a middle school classroom laboratory, students can do things that the greatest scientists in the world couldn't do 15 or 20 years ago. Right? So we're about to enter a time when we can manipulate life in a way that was it was science fiction just a short time ago. And we have to do it thoughtfully and with deep thought. Now, I am part of that conversation. I try to be part of that conversation. I don't think I have any particularly brilliant insights. It's an ongoing conversation. But what I do think is really important is that conversation can't just happen between scientists and maybe ethicists. It's everybody's responsibility to contribute to that. All of us are going to be affected by it. And by everybody, I don't just mean, U.S. educated intellectuals. I mean, countries that are developing. I mean, tribal peoples. I mean, everybody needs to be part of this conversation. There's a mic. Use the mic, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up the CRISPR because it's been on my mind. And I always have this feeling of the ethicists sort of scurrying after what's already been created and trying to have some influence on it. But would there ever be a society where a CRISPR is invented and then it isn't used until ethicists and society talk about what the implications are?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There are, I mean, I think there's a misunderstanding of a couple of things. First of all, what ethicists do. Ethicists have no power. None. I make arguments. Nobody listens to me, or if they listen to me, it's a good day. So what ethicists try to do is get the conversation started and get people to think about these things. You want to give me some power to stop things? I won't even take it, because I know the ethicists, and you don't want us making your decisions. But the point is, we have, as society, stopped things in the past. We've stopped many more things than people think we've stopped. We've stopped things in medicine. There are all kinds of experiments that we don't do because ethics tells us we can't do it. We used to do them. Part of the reason that bioethics became what it is because of ways in which we violated ethical norms in the past, and we don't anymore. There's also a lot of prophylactic ethics works happening. I run a journal called the American Journal of Bioethics Neuroscience. Neuroscience is exploding. A lot of what our articles are about is what shouldn't we be doing. There were arguments, there were those kinds of arguments in the past, and some of them were pretty tough. So there was an argument over anencephalic children. These are children born without higher brains. They usually die fairly quickly, and they've got very useful organs, because infants who are born with defective hearts and things, it's very hard to find organs for them. So you have this perfect source of organs. A child who's going to die very quickly, who will never have life, is missing most of their brain, and why not use them for organ donors? There's just one problem. You can't wait till they die. You have to kill them. And there were parents of these kids, pediatric surgeons, they were all arguing, we have babies who are going to die without a heart. You've got this infant that doesn't have a brain who's going to die in 3 hours. Is it really murder to kill that infant? And many ethicists argued strongly, yes, it is. We can't cross that line. I know it makes some kind of sense, but you don't kill a human creature even to save another creature. By the way, very Jewish concept. And we won one. That argument was bought by the country, and we didn't allow the killing of anencephalic kids even to save the lives of other kids. Very controversial. Pediatric surgeons, some of them were outraged by it. It's a tough ethical decision. So sometimes we do make those kinds of decisions, even when they're tough.
Not to ask you to unfurl a whole nother talk on a related but different subject, I still couldn't help but wonder how you would apply the logic and the lessons of the Golem and the Frankenstein stories to another human creation that's unfolding with more sophistication but doesn't have a body. So that is artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
So which of these stories do you think is most profound for informing how we think about our responsibility as we create, artificial intelligence? And when is it time to take the parchment out of the mouth of the machine, right?
Right. So that's a wonderful question, and there's, as you say, that's a whole other talk. And in fact, there's an artificial intelligence case study that I brought to do with some of Laurie's students. The place where that's first happening in the ethics realm is in self-driving cars, right? So for the first time in human history, we are going to have to encode ethical algorithms into a machine. The car is going down the street, all of a sudden there's an emergency, it either has to go right and kill 3 pedestrians, or it has to go left and hit the wall and kill its inhabitants, or it has to go sort of off to the right where there's kids in a playground, which it may or may not hit, right? So you can't not make that decision. If you're going to have an artificial car, you have to give it some guidance of how to handle emergencies. And in that, you're going to have to actually write ethical algorithms that tell the car how to make a decision when it's in an emergency situation, which will require you to tell it who to kill. You can't get around it. So that's the first shot across the bow of ethical decision-making by a machine. And it is very controversial, and people are arguing about it with great interest at Google. And about 4 or 5 months ago, VW came out with a statement. Oh, so if you ask the American people in general, so the car is going to either hit the crowd or hit the wall and kill its inhabitants, ethically, what decision should it make? People will all say it should hit the wall and kill the inhabitants. They're the ones that have put the pedestrians in danger. They're the operators of the vehicle, even though they're not driving it. They're responsible for it, so they should take the hit first. Then you say to them, would you buy that car? And they go, no, I wouldn't buy that car. My kids might be in the back seat, right? And so VW came out a few months ago and said, we now announce that in our automatic cars, which they don't have yet, we now announce in our automatic cars, we are going to protect the lives of the inhabitants first and, you know, kill everyone else. And they got pilloried, and they withdrew that statement and said, okay, we'll go back and think about it some more. But, you know, that's the first step. You know, full artificial life way down the line. I think we need to do this incrementally and think about it incrementally. Oh, do Frankenstein and Golem?
I was going to ask, rather, is principles that would guide into deciding whether or not to choose the...
So last week or the week before, the CCAR, which is the National Organization of Reform Rabbis, was in Atlanta. And they asked me to come give a talk. I gave a completely different talk. And then I gave them out the example of artificial cars. I have the one I brought for Lori's class. And I said, here's what I want you to do. I want you go and debate it in little groups. But when you get up to the mic afterwards, I don't want you to give me your ethical solution to the car problem. I want you to tell me, how can Judaism give insights into how we should answer this? What does Judaism have to contribute to the ethics, to the problem of the self-driving car? And it was really fascinating. There were different kinds of answers. There were answers that drew from so one of the ways in which you debate Jewish ideas in Judaism is you draw from anecdotes from the tradition. So there's a very famous anecdote where the Jews answer differently than Christians in theology, which is two people are in the desert, there's one bottle of water, there's only enough water for one person. Do you have an obligation to share that water with the other person? If you share that water with the other person, you're both going to die. Do you have a right to keep it to yourself and save yourself? And Judaism says, yes, you do. Christianity says, no, you don't. You share it equally, and if you both die, you both die. I think it's a little easier because there are a lot more Christians than Jews. We have to, you know, we have to preserve the ones we have. No, I mean, it's a theological and deeply interesting conversation. So the rabbis would bring up those kinds of questions and those kinds of anecdotes. They talk about Jewish values. They talk about values of responsibility and how Judaism crystallized them. So, I mean, we could talk about that. We get way off base from this talk, but there are ways in which you leverage the tradition. I mean, that's what traditions are for. They're there to, if they can't address emerging modern questions, forget them. They're not of use to us in the modern world. Steve, use the other mic because I think that one's, yeah, that's a placebo mic.
So you mentioned CRISPR. Someone in the audience asked about CRISPR. There was, just as you know, Alta Chara just chaired this National Academy study about CRISPR modification of human embryos, and basically what they said is study safety, go very slow, think about it more. But I would posit that X years from now, a family with Tay-Sachs or Huntington's disease that doesn't want to make a lot of spare embryos and discard them will be able to repair these defective genes, and society will find that reasonable. Now, in parallel, and maybe not first in the United States, but in parallel, the genetics of complex traits, height, cognitive ability, you know, IQ, whatever, I know it's radioactive to talk about, but it's, you know, it's at least 70% genetically influenced, and of course you got to raise your kid right, you know, with all the right stimulation and so forth. That's all, it's happening, right? There's a paper that's going to be published next month in Nature Genetics showing a lot of genes involved in cognitive ability, and people will want not only to repair genes involved in Huntington's or Tay-Sachs, but they'll say, look, you know, this, you know, to succeed in our society, you got to be a doctor, you need a certain, you know, why don't we just just give these slightly different flavors of 3 or 4 genes, and this kid, instead of having an IQ of 95, will have an IQ of 120, and won't that be good? So there's a lot that could be said. I'm just curious whether there's any insight from your talk or from Jewish ethics about what I think is inevitable.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the question. Next question. Yeah. So the enhancement debate, which is really just distills what you just said, whether we should enhance people or not, you know, there are a number of problems with the anti-enhancement perspective. One is that there is no clear line between repair and enhancement. We don't really know what enhancement means, right? So if I was born with some problem on my legs, which meant I couldn't walk at a normal pace, and you could repair me up to the average normal pace, or in the top 10% of the normal pace, or faster than any other human being can walk, where is that enhancement line? And that gradualism of enhancement is true in almost any vector that you use. So there's a real problem with trying to say there's enhancement and there's therapy. It's all a continuum. That makes it really problematic to create a strong argument against enhancement. And I agree with you. We're already enhancing ourselves with psychopharmaceuticals. We enhance ourselves in other ways as well. Will we enhance ourselves genetically? Here, and the answer is we will. I mean, we eventually will. Americans take more psychotropics per capita, more drugs that affect the function of our brain than any other people in the world, and we worry about it more than any other people in the world. And that's who we are as Americans. We do it, and then we have a lot of angst about having done it. And I think that's exactly what's going to happen over time with this as well. But here's my concern, and I'm not going to, and I'll get to Judaism in 1 second, but I just want to say this because I think it's important. Imagine for a minute that this technology to be able to enhance human beings was discovered in 1860. And it was developed over the late 19th century, and it was finally ready to be used in Victorian England. And now they could enhance their children genetically. What would they have done? Would they have said, you know, girls, it's all about promiscuity, you know, they want to have sex too early. What if we can use genetic engineering to delay menses till they're 21, or to delay or to suppress sexual gratification? They might have done it thinking that it was to the greater good, and it was unquestioned that that's how it should be. Or if they had had it in communist China or many other societies. My concern is that we think we have it right. Increase their IQ, give them some musical ability, you know, who could argue against that? Well, who could have argued against that in Victorian England? We have this hubris about the fact that we're going to get it right because we're smarter now. I wonder 50, 100 years from now when they look back on our society, they'd say, how could they have thought that? Why would they enhance their kids that way? That was, I mean, just think about it. Think about how we think about gender fluidity now compared to 50 years ago. Think about what they would have done when they were already doing experiments on homosexuals to try to cure them, or when Freeman was going around doing orbital lobotomies. He had a lobotomy van, and he did tens of thousands of lobotomies, taking thin needles, pushing them up through the orbits of the eyes, into the brain, going like this, and creating lobotomies in 15 minutes. And why did he do it? Because someone would call him and say, my daughter is sleeping around. She's, you know, it was usually fighting for boys and another F word for girls was the reason why he would go and do lobotomies in people's homes. 15 minutes and he was out. And it was considered at the time, of course you do that, right? You can't have a teenage girl actually having sex. And so throughout history, we have culturally and historically contingent ideas that we think of as universal, and they change. And what are the traits that we're going to incarnate into the flesh of our children that then years down we're going to say, how could we have thought that that was the right thing to do? So that's what worries me. And given that as the deep worry, yes, I think Judaism has some things to say about what the right life is and what kinds of traits we should put into children and what kinds of things are noble human endeavors and what aren't, that aren't, you know, the flavor of the week, but go back thousands of years. So maybe there will be some guidance there.
Thank you. This has been a great talk, and I can't resist asking this question. Do you think that Mary Shelley was influenced by the Golem story?
So that's been one of those questions that literary scholars love to fight about. Nobody knows. But the odds are that she had heard it, because it was, the era that they lived in and the kind of culture that was going around there was very, very much an occultist. I mean, it was just, what's so amazing about Frankenstein is it captures a moment in historical time as thought was moving from alchemy to science, as it was moving from the occult to the natural, but it was still very much influenced, and was throughout the 19th century before there was sort of a final turning to science and away from a lot of that, at least in the general mind. And so those kinds of stories were very common in that day. We don't know if she actually heard it, but it's very possible that she did. Oh.
So thank you all for coming, and I also want to again thank the Ruderman Family Foundation for their generosity, the College of Social Science and Humanities, Dr. Jenny Sartori for all of her work as Associate Director of Jewish Studies in putting our programs together.